in Paris the draft agreement to try and bring the entire world onto the same roadmap to cut emissions, to try and slow down global warming. That draft agreement has just been released in the last 40 minutes or so, and now delegates from all over the world will be looking at those details and trying to work out whether they can all agree to this plan. Let me bring in my guests in London. Tom Burke is chairman of the environmental organisation E3G and is also a former advisor to the British government on climate change. Sam Gill is executive editor of ChinaDialogue.net, and Professor Joanna Haigh is professor at the Imperial College London, and she's co-director of the Grantham Institute that works on climate change and environmental issues. Welcome to all of you. Professor Haigh, I wanted to start with you. What do you make so far of this draft agreement? There seems to be some kind of, well, I can't say agreement, but the draft certainly talks about a goal of keeping temperatures down, the rise down to 1.5 degrees. And it talks about some kind of unspecified system to monitor what countries are doing.
Yes, sure. Hello. Well, of course, before we get into the details of how it's going to happen, I think we should start off with a very positive perspective. If you look back to what happened in Copenhagen 6 years ago, which was all such a disaster and they didn't agree anything at all, even 2 weeks ago when we entered into these discussions, we didn't think that something like 1.5 degrees was on the table. So the fact that it's actually in the paperwork is a really positive step forward. Of course, the problem is in actually trying to meet those ambitions and getting the countries to engage. But there's been a number of things agreed as part of, or not agreed, but put on the table as part of this draft, which includes reviews of the countries' commitments to decarbonisation. It includes financing of the poorer countries to help them go into a greener, low-carbon industrial world. So I'm quite positive about it.
And Tom Burke, let me bring you in. You have advised the British government on climate change, so lots of difficult decisions balancing both the needs of industry and the effect on ordinary people. What do you make of the draft?
I think what's really important about this draft is much more than the specifics of the text is the direction of travel it outlines. It now makes it really clear that we're at a turning point. We're moving away from a world that depended on high carbon energy for its energy supplies and is now moving and going to move further and faster than anybody would have thought of before this agreement towards a low carbon economy based on energy efficiency, more use of renewables. So I'm quite positive about where we've got to.
Sam Gill, sorry, who wanted to come in there?
One of the biggest shifts that's happening here is that there is in the real economy a shift moving away from fossil fuels, and this has been underpinned, I think, in large part by the low carbon transition that we've seen in emerging economies, particularly in China. We've seen a landmark agreement between the United States and China last year that set the stage for China agreeing to a peak year. That's one of the major differences with what we saw at Copenhagen, was that China was unwilling to commit to a peak year on its emissions. It's now saying that it will peak in 2030, and that it's going to make efforts to come in earlier. It's talking about enormous, really ambitious targets for the installation of renewables. It has a target to install 800 gigawatts of non-fossil fuels by over the next 15 years. That's equivalent to adding the entire US electricity grid just in non-fossil fuels. And we've seen fossil fuels and coal in particular in a structural decline in China, and I think that's starting to show sort of the direction that things are moving and the extent to which these sorts of agreements are actually underpinned by really what's happening in the world's largest economies.
Yes, I agree that this whole world position has changed, and particularly the discussions between China and the USA that took part last year as part of the G7 put us all into a new era where it was obviously clear that the countries were trying to go forward. I think the issue with China, of course, is it's great that they are saying they're going to peak at 2030 and all the things that we've just heard about, but we have to be sort of slight realistic about these things. China is still the largest emitter of carbon, and it's far in excess of what we can cope with if we're going to get to a transition of a well below 2 degrees. But let's not be too negative. Let's look at the positive. We're all going in the right direction.
Joanna mentioned the disaster at Copenhagen, which was the last big climate summit, and she's right about that. But it's very interesting. If after that disaster you'd said that within 5 years China was going to have agreed to peak its emissions and the G7 countries were going to have to agree to have decarbonised their economy by the end of the century, people would have thought you were mad. Well, if that's the result you got from a failure, what do you think you're actually going to get from a success? Which I think people everywhere now beginning to see this as a success.
Well, if you've just joined us, you're listening to a very special edition of World Have Your Say. We're talking about climate change because in Paris, a draft agreement has been made public. This is a draft agreement that hopes to rope in 190 nations to put everyone on the same roadmap towards cutting emissions and slowing down global warming. We were hearing there from our guests in London that this is